Scotland loses UK climate change lead, advisors war. Scotland has lost its lead over the rest of the UK on tackling climate change, advisory has won. A report from the Climate Change Committee (CCC) said progress on cutting greenhouse gases emissions has largely stalled in recent years. Its independent assessment said Scotland staggered, some of the toughest in the world were increasingly at risk. The Scottish government insisted progress was being made in many areas. The Scottish government has set a legally binding target to cut the greenhouse gases emissions to get net zero by 2045. 5 years ahead of the date set of the UK as a whole. As a staging post, it legislated in 2019 to cut emissions by massive 75% in 1990 baseline levels by the end of the decade. That is way ahead of UK government's aim to reduce emissions by 68% in the same time frame. The latest CCC report points out that since its Climate Change Act became law in 2009, the Scottish government has failed to achieve 7 of 11 legal targets. Although it met the latest one for the 2020, it said that it was because of COVID pandemic saw a temporary drop in transport emissions and that the figures will rebound in future years. The figures for 2020 was 58.7% reduction for the 1990 baseline, but the previous year was just 51%, but for the previous year it was just 51%. The CCC report recommended lowering the annual target so that 2025 aims would be reduce emission by 61% rather than 65.5%. The report describes the target to cut emissions by 75% by 2030 as extremely challenging and suggested a 65% to 67% cut more feasible. It said that the Scottish government lacked a clear delivery plan that had not offered a coherent explanation for how its policies would achieve its target. While the committee praised the ambitious and focus on the transitions, which is fair and equitable, it said the shot only will be applauded if the targets are achieved. CCC Chief Executive Chris Stark told Scotland he did not think the Scottish government was doing nearly enough to get and track to its legal targets. He said, "We have seen failures across the board and it's shame to say that. This year we were able to say Scotland has lost its lead in decarbonizing. Scotland is now at same rate now as the rest of the UK and that did not used to be in the case." Mr. Strake said Scott's early success was cutting emissions from electricity generations such as closing coal-fired power stations. But he said the Scottish government had the power to take actions on the decarbonizing buildings, transport and farming and had not to use them. Net Zero Minister Michael Matheson said the Climate Change Committee advice was a reminder to the scale of the challenges. He said progress has been made. Scotland is already more than halfway to zero net, but we are now entering the most challenging part of the journey today, with a need to halve our emissions again within the next 8 years. Mr. Matheson said that in many areas progress on reducing emission in Scotland was dependent on decisions taken by the UK government. In Paris in 2015, World Leaders Committee to limiting global warming to between 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, harmful greenhouse gases emissions which causes the earth to warm, have more than doubled in Scotland in past 30 years. But with the planet already 1.1 Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial times, rapid progress is needed in next 10 years if those temperature targets are to be met. It said that the Scottish government has been unwillingly to consider measures to recover the shortfall, such as by restricting growth in aviation. The committee said the policies to decarbonize buildings were wholly inadequate and would not deliver the scale of low-carbon heating required. On agriculture and land use, it said it was unclear how the emission targets could be delivered without new policies and said restoration rates for better land, a key store for the carbon, were less than half of the Scottish government's targets, which is itself less than half of the CCC recommendation. Mike Robinson from Stop Climate Chaos Scotland (SCCS) said the report was a wake-up call for the Scottish government. He said Scotland needs bold and decisive and immediate action to reduce emissions. Without this, The trend of missed targets and failure to tackle the climate crisis will only continue. From environmental campaign group WWF, Scotland said the report did not pull its punches. He said that without ambitious efforts to transform how we heat our homes and new policies to reduce farming emissions, Scotland's mantle of climate leader could be jeopardy. Meanwhile, Scottish Conservatives Net Zero spokesperson Liam Kerr MSP said the damning report showed the SNP Green government were falling miles short in taking actions required to tackle the climate emergency. Scottish Labour accused the Scottish government of empty rhetoric and warned the climate targets were in danger of becoming meaningless. Thank you.